Okay, welcome back. So what we're going to talk about now is empire in Central Asia. Remember, when we talk about the recent imperial period from the 19th to 20th centuries, what we're basically talking about is Russia coming in and then the Soviet Union taking form. As the Soviet Union took form, Russia was again primarily in charge. Central Asia has been really a dumping ground for those of the imperial masters in Moscow this entire period. People they didn't want around. In some ways, we've got the same thing going on today. Sort of an anecdote from when I was a political economic officer there. There was a Polish consular officer in Tashkent who was infamous. I mean, he was basically an outcast for bad behavior elsewhere, and so he ended up finding his job here in Tashkent. He was known for womanizing, for going out drinking, for all of these sorts of scandals. And the reason I'm telling you this is it was just like that in the 19th century with Russia as well. So we're going to start by talking about what empire is, and then we'll look at why the Russians decided to move south into Central Asia and the tactics they used to gain control over the region. And then we'll move on to the sort of control the Russian Empire exercised over Central Asia throughout that period and how migration to and from Central Asia was used to consolidate Russian power there. So, empire. I guess the first question is, what is empire? And this is important. The definitions here are important. It's an important question because people ask today if Central Asia is going to go back to a new Russian quasi-empire. Not just in Central Asia, but in other parts of the former Soviet space. But in particular, especially Belarus, for example. Ukraine recently has run up against this question. But in Central Asia, this is particularly important. It raises the question of how dependencies develop and their effects on autonomy. We can talk about a couple things. Empire is defined as the practice of one country extending its control over the territory, political system, or economic life of another country. These are just a couple standard definitions for you. A system of interaction between two political entities, one of which the dominant metropole exerts political control over the internal and external policy, the effective sovereignty of the other, the subordinate periphery. So a couple important definitions here are the metropole, or the core, that is the imperial master. The periphery is that area that's been imperialized or colonized, and a protectorate. So let me step back 1 second. So imperialism is this extension of control, but a protectorate is sort of empire by invitation, when people invite you in. And then we've got colonialism, which is an important subset of imperialism. It involves more active involvement than empire. Many empires were largely irrelevant to populations on a day-to-day basis. Colonies are felt. Here you've got colonizers who are active on the ground, and they dominate the resources, labor, markets, colonial territory. And they impose socio-cultural and religious and linguistic structures on the conquered population. So you can have an empire where people are primarily autonomous, but have to pay tributes. This is the case, for example, in the Mongol Empire. People paid tributes, but they were largely ignored besides that. That's not exactly true. The Mongols came to town on occasion, and they killed lots and lots of people. But then they left again, okay? And they had their vassals, the princes in the region, collect their taxes for them. But in a colonial state, you've actually got people living on the ground from the empire. So this means that the core has to have the necessary men and the money, and the periphery has to be relatively weak to make this happen. Empires serve some sort of overarching national interest, whether it's economic, ideological, geopolitical. This is important because it doesn't have to be for economics. And often empires are a drain on the periphery, on the core, the metropole. So when we talk about colonization, we can talk about a fear of colonization from the outside, but there's also the prospect of autocolonization. Autocolonization is where people or their political masters in one country accept some sort of decrease in sovereignty in hopes that in return for that, they're going to get enhanced security, material benefits, some other kind of benefits from that external power. So it's a little bit different than a protectorate. It's more sort of, but I suppose it's similar in some ways to a protectorate. But what it is it's sort of gaining advantage from the metropole. And of course, the metropole is gaining advantage from them as well. So this is what we mean when we're talking about empires. And why do states engage in empire building? Well, it's important to understand how states engage in empire building. They can come through a massive military march, and the picture that you see here is just this. It's the sacking of Russian town, Suzdal, by the Mongols. But they can also come through what Waltz calls this quote-unquote tyranny of small decisions. So think, for example, about how South Africa was settled. If you've taken Poly 260, you have the Dutch East India Company, which came into South Africa, and at first it was it didn't really look like an imperial power in any way. It was a trading company that set up a resupply station at the southern tip of Africa. But eventually they had to expand because in order to resupply ships that are going around the southern tip of Africa to try to get to India, you need land. You need animals, right? You need to take over more and more land. And so they expanded, and they expanded, and expanded, and expanded, and pretty soon you had South Africa under apartheid. It took a few hundred years. But so this is this sort of incremental movement. So there can be a massive military march, or there can be an incremental movement. And what you saw in the case of Russia was really both. An expansion by military force, but it was really incremental. Sometimes local elites actually allow outsiders in, as I mentioned before, to gradually have their own power usurped by the imperial state, which was not their objective. Right? So they might create this opening because they fear they're going to lose power to their own local elites or masses, and so they align themselves with the outside power, and we saw this in Central Asia. They might fear worse external threats, which you didn't necessarily see in Central Asia, but you saw these internal threats that local elites align themselves with the Russians against. Or it could be more lucrative. Some people might just think, hey, those outsiders have a lot more to offer me. I can gain by being a vassal of theirs. So getting back to Central Asia and the picture that you see here, what was Russia's motivation for entering Central Asia? Well, it began with the chasing out of these invaders. So these are the invaders who went into Russia, these Mongols who invaded Russia in the 13th century. And by the 16th century, Ivan IV, the Russian Tsar, was pushing them out. And this was like tumbling dominoes. He liberated Kazan, then went to Astrakhan. And as the Mongols pushed out militarily, Russia expanded. And it expanded further south. And it also took on a commercial bend, like the Dutch in South Africa. Traders at the time, supported by the state, pushed further into Siberia in what some people refer to as a silent invasion. They pressed increasingly for links to India and the Far East, and Central Asia, of course, was on that road. From a state perspective, there was, by the 1700s, a concern about border security. Okay, there was also, you had the Brits who were in India that the Russians were fearful of. You also had local nomadic groups who knew no borders and sometimes wandered into Russia. But some in the state also saw that it was in the state's interest to protect these various trade routes that were running through Central Asia, trade routes to China as well as India. And so as the biggest push for expansion in Central Asia came, it was really a case of the tyranny of small decisions. So here's the trade route that we were talking about. And this is the main Silk Road that runs right through here, right through Central Asia. But the Russians wanted to get a piece of this as well. And so you see the Eurasian steppe route going here and here, going through Tashkent, okay, and then joining up to the Silk Road there, and then other connecting routes as well. So going back to this sort of tyranny of small decisions, how did Russia first build its forts? And the first fort was actually built in Semipalatinsk, and then they built one in Omsk. But the way this happened was a case of tyranny of small decisions. You had major splits in the Russian bureaucracy in the 1800s. The foreign ministry and the finance ministry didn't want to go further into Central Asia than they already were. The military, though, was in favor of a much more activist role in Central Asia. The foreign ministry was weary of adventurism because this could heat up relations with Great Britain. As you move into Central Asia, you're moving closer to India and Pakistan, Pakistan being part of that territory, where the Brits were. It also cost them in terms of men and money. That's something the finance ministry worried about, in particular, the large costs associated with this. It's also important to keep in mind the context, which is that Russia had been fighting the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, and this came at a huge cost. And finally, there was the important role of personalities, which we're not going to get into here. But the point here is that Russia was not a unitary actor. It wasn't that the Russian Tsar said, "We will go forth and conquer Central Asia." Instead, it was all this. It was people at the top within these bureaucracies, along with the Tsar, who were trying to figure out what to do about Central Asia, and ultimately the military won. As an aside, it's important to keep in mind that even when we consider ourselves the United States is also not a unitary actor. Think about the run-up to the Iraq War, if you recall, with Powell going up against Rumsfeld, so the State Department going up against the Defense Department, the State Department resisting the war and the Defense Department advocating for the war, until Powell was turned and went to Rumsfeld's side. So why do you think the military won in the case of Russia going into Central Asia? Well, one of the big reasons was that they had strong allies. There was a very strong and a very loud voice of the Russian merchants, who were pursuing, as I noted here, all these different trade relations. It was a really difficult place to engage in trade thanks to this tough climate and the antagonistic locals. Remember when we talked about the unsettled peoples? I mentioned that they were fierce towards their competition, although they could also be very nice to visitors. Not if the visitors wanted to take advantage of them. So domestic textiles needed more cotton, which was being grown in Central Asia, and this was a second reason that Russia wanted to expand there, to have more cotton growing. And this was especially important after world prices for cotton rose with the U.S. Civil War from 1861 to 65. Central Asian cotton became increasingly important. It also turned out that Central Asia was very convenient to reduce Russian domestic pressures for land. So, again, context is important here. The Russian Tsar emancipated the serfs in 1861, and he allowed everyone to buy land from their landowners. The serfs were half of the estimated 40 million peasants at the time, and really increased the need for land. And so Central Asia became a good place to put the landless and impoverished peasants of Russia. Ultimately, the Russian foreign ministry had a weak case. He couldn't sell his policy abroad, like it or not. And Russians in Central Asia had this civilizing mission, as Westerners in Africa and Asia referred to this. And this became known as the Great Game. So after losing the Crimean War, which was basically France, England, and Turkey against Russia, they were trying to regain access to the Black Sea at the time. Russia now turned its attention to Central Asia. This was its only hope of countering British world dominance. There was a belief among Russian military officers that the Brits only respected those that they feared. It was eat or be eaten. And so the Brits thought that Russia wanted India, since Russia was moving south, and the Russians thought the Brits wanted to get into Central Asia. And this became the reason for the Great Game. So the Russian strategy here was divide and conquer. Well, let me take this in another set of slides.